I knew I was underdressed the moment I stepped out of the car. The vineyard stretched across the hills of Napa Valley, like something from a magazine advertisement. Endless rows of grapevines rolled beneath the golden California sunset, and at the center of it all stood the wedding venue itself, a massive white estate wrapped in flowers and glowing string lights. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway. Women in elegant silk dresses moved across the stone courtyard holding champagne glasses. Men in tailored suits laughed beside outdoor fire pits while a violin quartet played softly somewhere near the entrance. Everything about the place felt expensive, carefully designed, perfect. And standing there in my simple navy blue dress, I suddenly felt painfully aware of every dollar I didn't have. I smoothed my hands over the fabric anyway. It was the nicest dress I owned. I had bought it 3 months earlier specifically for this wedding after secretly picking up extra bookkeeping work on weekends. Beside me, my son Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his tuxedo while staring toward the venue entrance. Nervous, distracted, excited. He looked so much like his father at that moment that it almost hurt to look at him. "You okay, Mom?" he asked quickly, barely glancing at me. I forced a smile. "Of course." He nodded absent-mindedly, already checking his phone again. Wedding coordinator messages. Groomsmen questions. Last-minute schedule changes. The poor boy had barely slept all week. Before I could say anything else, a sharp female voice called from near the entrance. "Ethan." "Vanessa." She walked toward us quickly, the bottom of her white rehearsal dress flowing behind her. Even casually dressed, she looked flawless. Perfect makeup. Perfect hair. Perfect posture. Everything about her always looked controlled, planned. Her eyes landed on me briefly before returning to Ethan. "There you are," she said, kissing his cheek quickly. "My parents are asking for you." Then her gaze flickered downward toward my dress. Just for a second. But I caught it. That tiny pause people make when they're trying not to judge you. "Oh," she said lightly. "You actually wore that one." The comment was soft enough to sound harmless, but not harmless enough to miss. I felt heat rise slightly into my face. Ethan didn't seem to notice. "What's wrong with it?" he asked distractedly. Vanessa immediately smiled. "Nothing," she said sweetly. "It's just a little more casual than most people are wearing." Most people. Not everyone. Just me. I gave a small laugh like it didn't bother me. "Well," I said, "I figured navy blue was safe." "It's fine," Vanessa replied quickly. "Fine." That word again. Always polite. Always subtle. Never openly cruel enough to confront. But just sharp enough to leave a bruise. Vanessa slipped her arm through Ethan's. "Come on," she said. "My mom's already stressed." Ethan nodded and looked back at me. "You coming?" "Right behind you." But they were already walking ahead before I finished speaking. I followed slowly through the courtyard, trying not to notice how different I looked from everyone else. Most of the guests clearly belonged to Vanessa's world. Private equity firms. Luxury real estate developers. Tech executives. People who wore confidence as naturally as clothing. Meanwhile, I had spent the past 25 years balancing grocery budgets and repairing broken appliances with YouTube tutorials, because there was never enough money for real repairs. After my husband died, survival became a full-time job. And every extra dollar went toward Ethan. His school clothes. His soccer fees. His college tuition. I still remembered nights when I pretended I wasn't hungry, so he could have seconds at dinner. But standing here now, surrounded by wealth and polished smiles, none of those sacrifices seemed visible. To these people, I was simply the groom's awkward middle-aged mother, who didn't quite fit the picture. Inside the estate, servers carried trays of champagne through the rehearsal dinner crowd. The dining hall looked breathtaking. Tall candles flickered along long wooden tables covered in white roses and crystal glasses. At the center hung enormous chandeliers that bathed the room in soft golden light. A woman near the entrance smiled at me politely. "Bride or groom's side?" "Groom's," I answered. Something about the way she nodded made me feel like she already knew. Of course I was from the groom's side. I looked like the groom's side. Working class. Ordinary. Forgettable. Across the room, Vanessa's parents greeted guests like politicians at a fundraiser. Her father wore a custom black suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her mother, Diane, stood beside him in a pale designer gown with diamonds resting against her throat. When Diane noticed me, her smile tightened slightly. "Linda," she said politely as I approached. "You made it." "Made it?" As if there had been doubt. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied. Her eyes swept over my outfit so quickly most people wouldn't have noticed. I noticed. "Oh," she said with a small smile. "Napa evenings can get chilly. I hope you brought something warmer." Translation: "That dress looks cheap." I smiled anyway. "I'll survive." Diane gave a tiny nod before immediately turning toward another guest approaching behind me. Conversation over. Dismissed. I stood there awkwardly for a moment before moving toward the drink table. I suddenly wished I had someone to talk to. Most of Ethan's childhood friends were now scattered around the country. The few relatives I invited couldn't afford the trip. So while Vanessa's side filled the venue with loud laughter and expensive jewelry, I stood alone beside the champagne buckets pretending not to feel invisible. "Mrs. Harper?" I turned. One of the bridesmaids smiled politely. "Vanessa wanted me to let you know the family photos are starting in 20 minutes. "Oh," I said quickly. "Okay." She hesitated awkwardly. "And she asked if maybe you could stand near the end?" I frowned slightly. "The end?" "The outside spot," the bridesmaid clarified carefully. "For balance." "For balance." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was humiliating. Apparently even the wedding photos had an aesthetic hierarchy. I nodded slowly. "Of course." The bridesmaid looked relieved and quickly walked away. I stared down at my untouched champagne glass. For a brief moment, I considered leaving. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just quietly slipping back to my hotel room and pretending I felt sick. But then I spotted Ethan across the room laughing with two of his college friends. And just like that, the thought disappeared. Because no matter how uncomfortable I felt, this was still my son's wedding. I had not worked 2 jobs for 15 years to miss this moment. I moved toward the outdoor terrace where the rehearsal dinner was beginning. As guests found their seats, I noticed the seating arrangement immediately. Vanessa's family sat near the center. Important guests closest to the couple. Business partners nearby. Close relatives surrounding them. My seat was near the far end of the table beside 2 distant cousins I had never met. Again subtle. Always subtle. But impossible not to notice. Dinner began with speeches and laughter. Stories about Vanessa's childhood. Stories about her achievements. Her law degree. Her charity work. Her family vacations in Europe. When it was Ethan's turn, I smiled proudly while guests applauded him. Because despite everything, my son truly was good. Kind. Hardworking. The kind of man who held doors open for strangers and called his mother every Sunday even during busy work weeks. That was why tonight hurt so much. Because somewhere along the way, he had become too distracted to notice what was happening right in front of him. Halfway through dinner, Ethan stood to greet another table. I watched him disappear into the crowd of guests. And that was when I heard it. Vanessa's voice. Soft. Low. But clear enough. "This whole weekend just needs to look perfect," she whispered to one of her bridesmaids. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I simply happened to be close enough. The bridesmaid laughed quietly. Vanessa sighed. "I mean, Ethan's mother doesn't exactly fit the aesthetic." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were shocking. Because deep down, I already knew she felt that way. The bridesmaid glanced toward me nervously. "I don't think she heard you." Vanessa followed her gaze. For one brief second, our eyes met across the candlelit terrace, and I watched the color drain slightly from her face. But only for a second. Then her expression smoothed over again into that same polished smile. Controlled. Elegant. Perfect. She walked toward me slowly. "Linda," she said warmly. "Are you enjoying yourself?" I stared at her for a moment. I could have confronted her. Could have embarrassed her right there in front of everyone. But Ethan looked so happy tonight. So hopeful. And I couldn't bear the idea of ruining that for him. So instead, I forced a smile. "It's beautiful," I said quietly. Vanessa relaxed instantly. "Oh good." she replied. I'm so glad. But for the first time since arriving in Napa, I realized something painful. Vanessa didn't just dislike me. She was embarrassed by me. And suddenly, surrounded by candlelight and expensive laughter, I had never felt more alone in my entire life. At the far end of the terrace, the wedding planner tapped a glass gently. Everyone, she announced brightly, tomorrow is going to be absolutely magical. Guests applauded. Music drifted softly into the warm California night. And while everyone around me celebrated the beginning of a perfect marriage, a quiet feeling settled deep inside my chest. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And I was starting to think I might not be wanted at this wedding at all. I barely slept that night. The rehearsal dinner ended with laughter, champagne, and expensive desserts served beneath glowing string lights while I sat quietly at the end of the table pretending my chest didn't ache. By the time I returned to my hotel room, Napa Valley had gone still. Moonlight stretched across the vineyards outside my window. Somewhere far off, music from another wedding drifted faintly through the hills. I sat on the edge of the bed and slowly removed my earrings. For a long moment, I simply stared at myself in the mirror. Tired eyes. Fine lines near my mouth. Gray beginning to appear in my hair despite the dye. I suddenly understood something painful. Vanessa wasn't embarrassed by something I had done. She was embarrassed by who I was. A widowed middle-class woman from Sacramento who still clipped grocery coupons and drove a 12-year-old Honda. I didn't belong in her polished world of country clubs and luxury vacations. And tonight she had made that very clear. I reached for my phone beside the lamp. There was a text from Ethan. Sorry tonight was so hectic. Love you, Mom. See you tomorrow morning. My eyes burned slightly reading it. Because that was the problem. Ethan truly loved me. I knew he did. But love wasn't always enough when someone spent years trying to become part of a different world. I typed back quickly. I love you too. Get some sleep. Then I turned off the light and lay awake for almost 3 hours staring into the darkness. The next morning, the vineyard looked like something out of a dream. Golden sunlight spilled across the hills. Wedding staff hurried between flower arrangements and white folding chairs placed neatly beside the vines. Everything smelled faintly of roses and fresh grass. Perfect weather. Perfect scenery. Perfect wedding. I stood near the outdoor coffee station holding a paper cup between both hands while guests slowly gathered for the ceremony. Most people were dressed beautifully already. Designer heels sinking carefully into the gravel paths. Men adjusting expensive watches beneath crisp suit sleeves. I had chosen my outfit carefully that morning. A soft lavender dress with a silver necklace Ethan had given me on my 50th birthday. Simple. Elegant. Safe. At least I hoped so. Linda. I turned at the sound of my name. Vanessa approached with 2 bridesmaids trailing behind her. Even in the middle of wedding chaos, she looked flawless. Her makeup was already done. Hair pinned perfectly beneath a silk robe. The kind of effortless beauty magazines loved. There you are, she said brightly. Something about her smile felt rehearsed. I wanted to talk to you for a second. The bridesmaids exchanged awkward glances before stepping away toward the garden entrance. Vanessa waited until they were gone before lowering her voice slightly. Listen, she began carefully. I've been trying to figure out the best way to say this. My stomach tightened immediately. She folded her arms lightly. I really think today would go more smoothly if you skipped the ceremony. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. I'm sorry. She sighed softly like this conversation was exhausting for her too. I just think emotions are running high, and honestly, yesterday felt a little uncomfortable. Uncomfortable for who? For everyone, she replied quickly. You seemed upset at dinner. I almost laughed. Upset? She had humiliated me all weekend. Now she was rewriting the story as though I were the problem. I'm Ethan's mother, I said quietly. Why would I skip his wedding? Vanessa glanced toward the ceremony setup where guests were beginning to gather. Then she looked back at me. Because this day is supposed to be about Ethan and me. The words landed harder than I expected. Not cruel. Not loud. Just cold. Calculated. You think I'm going to ruin your wedding? I asked softly. She hesitated just long enough to answer the question without saying yes. I think people notice things, she replied carefully. Appearance matters. Energy matters. My family is already stressed enough. My throat tightened. And suddenly every subtle comment from the past year came rushing back. The way Vanessa corrected my grammar once at dinner and laughed afterward. The way she suggested Ethan stop helping me financially because married couples need boundaries. The way she once called my neighborhood charming, with that same careful smile. I had ignored all of it because Ethan loved her. Because I wanted to believe she would eventually accept me. But standing there beneath the bright California sun, I finally realized something. She never intended to. Vanessa took a slow breath. I booked a car for you, she said gently. It can take you back to the hotel. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. A car. She had planned this ahead of time. You already arranged it? I whispered. It's just easier this way. Easier. The word felt like a knife. I looked around instinctively. Guests laughed nearby. Servers carried trays of champagne toward the garden. Wedding coordinators adjusted flower arches beneath the vines. And only a few feet away from all that beauty, I was being quietly removed from my own son's wedding like an unwanted guest. Did Ethan ask for this? I finally asked. Vanessa answered too quickly. No. He's overwhelmed already. I didn't want to upset him with unnecessary drama. That told me everything. He didn't know. A long silence stretched between us. Then Vanessa softened her expression again. If it helps, she said gently, I think leaving gracefully would be best for everyone. Leaving gracefully. As though I were some embarrassing scene she needed cleaned up before guests arrived. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry in front of her. Not here. Not now. So instead I nodded once. Okay, I said quietly. Relief flashed across her face so quickly she couldn't hide it. Thank you, she replied. Really? I set my untouched coffee cup down on the table. Then I walked away before she could say another word. The drive back toward town blurred together. Vineyards passed outside the window while I stared silently at my hands in my lap. The driver didn't ask questions. Thank God. Because I wasn't sure I could answer without breaking apart completely. I kept replaying one thought over and over in my mind. Don't ruin Ethan's day. That was all that mattered. Not my humiliation. Not my heartbreak. Just Ethan. I had spent his entire life protecting him from pain. This would simply be one more time. The car dropped me near a small diner a few miles from the hotel. I suddenly couldn't bear the thought of sitting alone in that room yet. So instead, I walked inside. The diner smelled like coffee, butter, and bacon grease. Country music played softly from an old speaker near the kitchen. A waitress in her 60s smiled kindly as she handed me a menu. Just one. I forced a small smile. Yes. I slid into a booth near the window. Outside, tourists wandered slowly through downtown Napa while sunlight reflected off nearby storefronts. Normal life continued. Meanwhile, my son was getting married without me. My chest tightened again at the thought. The waitress returned with coffee. You okay, honey? She asked gently. That almost broke me. Because strangers always seemed kinder than people trying to impress the world. I've fine. Elite softly. She squeezed my shoulder once before walking away. And somehow that tiny act of kindness hurt more than Vanessa's cruelty. I stared down at the menu without reading it. Then my phone buzzed. Ethan. Panic flashed through me instantly. I answered quickly. Iswat. Mom, he said immediately. Where are you? My heart stopped. What do you mean? You're not here. Voices echoed behind him. Wedding music. Movement. Confusion. I thought maybe you were getting ready, he continued. Vanessa said you left early this morning. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course she lied. Just. I swallowed carefully. I wasn't feeling very well. A long pause followed. You sound upset. I'm okay. Mom. That single word nearly shattered me. I gripped the edge of the table tightly. I didn't want to cause stress today, I whispered. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Ethan asked quietly. Did something happen? I opened my mouth. And closed it again. Because what was I supposed to say? Your fiancé threw me out of your wedding? Your future wife is ashamed of me? No mother wants to destroy her son's happiness hours before he walks down the aisle. So instead, I lied for him. No, I said softly. Everything's fine. But mothers know their children. And children know their mothers. Ethan immediately understood I wasn't telling the truth. I'm coming to get you, he said suddenly. No. The word came out too fast. Too desperate. Ethan, don't. Please. Mom. Today is your wedding. My voice cracked slightly. You need to stay there. He lowered his voice. Did Vanessa say something to you? My silence answered for me. And suddenly I heard something shift in his breathing. Not anger yet. Something worse. Doubt. Real doubt. Mom, he said slowly. What exactly happened? Before I could answer, another voice called loudly in the background. Ethan, we need you for photos. Vanessa. Even through the phone, I recognized her voice immediately. A few seconds passed. Then Ethan spoke again, quieter now. I'll call you back. The line disconnected. I lowered the phone slowly. My hands were shaking. And for the first time since arriving in Napa, I had the terrible feeling that something much bigger was beginning to crack beneath the surface of this perfect wedding. For almost 20 minutes after Ethan hung up, I sat frozen inside the diner booth staring at my untouched coffee. Around me, life continued normally. Forks clinked against plates. A baby cried somewhere near the back. Country music drifted softly through the speakers above the counter. But inside my chest, everything felt painfully unsteady. I knew that tone in Ethan's voice. He was suspicious now. And once Ethan started questioning something, he rarely stopped until he reached the truth. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt terrified. Because no matter what Vanessa had done to me, I still didn't want to be the reason my son's wedding collapsed. The waitress returned carrying a plate of eggs and toast. I didn't order. Honey, you look like you need to eat something, she interrupted gently. I almost smiled. Thank you. She gave me another sympathetic look before walking away. I picked up my fork, but before I could take a bite, the bell above the diner door rang. Cold air swept briefly through the room. At first, I didn't look up. Then I heard hurried footsteps. And a familiar voice. Mom. My heart stopped. I turned sharply toward the entrance. Ethan stood there still wearing his black tuxedo. His tie hung loose now. His hair looked slightly disheveled, like someone had been dragging nervous hands through it. And for the first time all weekend, he looked completely lost. The entire diner seemed to go quiet around us. Even the waitress behind the counter glanced up in surprise. A man in a tuxedo walking into a roadside diner in the middle of the afternoon wasn't exactly subtle. Ethan's eyes found mine instantly. Then he walked toward the booth. Slowly. Almost cautiously. Like he wasn't entirely sure what he was about to hear. He slid into the seat across from me without speaking. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I noticed his breathing first. Too fast. His jaw tight. Something had already happened. Finally he spoke. Why didn't you tell me? His voice wasn't angry. That somehow hurt more. I looked down at my hands. There was nothing to tell. Mom. He leaned forward slightly. Vanessa told me you left because you were tired. I stayed silent. She said you didn't want attention on yourself today. Still silence. Then Ethan gave a short, humorless laugh under his breath. And when I asked why you sounded upset on the phone, he shook his head slowly. She suddenly started panicking. A knot tightened in my chest. What do you mean? She got defensive immediately, he replied quietly. Started saying you were emotional. That weddings are stressful. That maybe you misunderstood something. He looked directly at me now. And that's when I realized something. I swallowed carefully. What? I've spent the last 2 years making excuses for behavior I knew wasn't okay. The words settled heavily between us. Outside the diner window, cars rolled slowly past on the street. Inside, the waitress discreetly moved other customers farther away. Sensing this wasn't an ordinary conversation, Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. I need you to tell me exactly what happened. I opened my mouth, closed it again. Because even now, sitting across from my son in a half-empty diner while he wore the tuxedo meant for his wedding ceremony. I still wanted to protect him. She was stressed, I said quietly. That's all. His expression hardened slightly. Mom. She didn't mean it. What did she say? I hesitated too long. And Ethan noticed. His eyes lowered slowly to the table. Then he nodded once to himself like a man confirming something painful. She asked you to leave, didn't she? Tears burned instantly behind my eyes. I looked away toward the window. And my silence answered him. For several seconds Ethan didn't move. Didn't speak. Then he leaned back slowly in the booth like the weight of something had finally settled onto his shoulders. Oh my God, he whispered. I reached for him instinctively. Ethan. She actually did it. His voice cracked slightly. She really did it. I shook my head quickly. She was overwhelmed. Weddings make people crazy sometimes. No, he looked at me firmly now. Stop defending her. The sharpness in his voice startled me. Not because he was angry at me. Because he sounded angry at himself. He stared down at the table for a long moment before speaking again. She told you to leave my wedding. I tried to smile faintly. I wasn't technically kicked out. Mom. His eyes lifted to mine again. She removed you from the ceremony because she thought you embarrassed her. Hearing the truth spoken out loud made my chest ache all over again. But Ethan wasn't finished. And the worst part, he continued quietly, this isn't even the first time. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? He let out a slow breath. There were comments before. His voice sounded distant now, frustrated with himself. Little things. About your clothes. About your neighborhood. About how you talked. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. And every time, he admitted, I told myself she didn't mean it. I stared at him. Because deep down, I had done the exact same thing. Ethan leaned back and laughed bitterly under his breath. I can't believe I let this happen. You love her, I said softly. He looked exhausted suddenly. Yeah. A long silence followed. Then his phone buzzed against the table. Vanessa. Her name lit up the screen beside his untouched coffee. Neither of us moved. The phone buzzed again almost immediately. Then again. Ethan stared at it for several seconds before finally flipping it face down. She's probably panicking, I said quietly. She should be. Something in his voice had changed now. Not loud anger. Something colder. More disappointed. I studied him carefully. Ethan. What happened after we got off the phone? He exhaled slowly through his nose. At first I tried to convince myself maybe there was some misunderstanding. He rubbed his jaw tiredly. But then I started paying attention. To what? To everything. He stared down at the table while speaking. The bridesmaids looked nervous around me. Vanessa wouldn't stop talking. She kept trying to explain things I hadn't even accused her of yet. His expression darkened slightly. And then Derek showed up. Derek. His best man. I frowned. What does Derek have to do with this? Ethan gave a humorless smile. That's what I asked myself. He looked away briefly before continuing. I walked into one of the side rooms near the vineyard because I needed a minute alone. His jaw tightened again. And I heard them arguing. A cold feeling spread slowly through my chest. Arguing about what? Ethan laughed once under his breath. At first? About me. He looked exhausted saying it. Vanessa was freaking out because she thought I knew. Knew what? He finally met my eyes again. And the pain there nearly broke me. She's been sleeping with Derek. For a second, I genuinely thought I had heard him wrong. What? They didn't know I was outside the room. His voice stayed calm, but barely. I heard enough. The diner suddenly felt too quiet. Too small. Oh, Ethan. She kept saying he needed to stay calm until after the ceremony. He swallowed hard. And Derek told her she should have handled my mother better, because now I was suspicious. I covered my mouth with one hand. My heart physically hurt for him. Because betrayal was one thing. Humiliation was another. But realizing the people closest to you had been lying to your face for months? That kind of pain changed people. Ethan stared blankly toward the diner window. You know what the worst part is? I shook my head slowly. I wasn't even shocked. That sentence shattered me, because it meant some part of him had already known. Maybe not consciously, but deep down, he had felt the cracks forming long before today. I ignored so much, he whispered. She flirted constantly. She hid her phone. She treated every relationship like some kind of performance. His voice lowered further, and I kept telling myself marriage would settle everything down. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. You wanted your life to work. He laughed bitterly again. No. I wanted a perfect life. The honesty in that sentence sat heavily between us. Outside, clouds had started drifting across the bright Napa sky. The sunlight inside the diner softened slightly, and suddenly Ethan looked less like a groom on his wedding day, and more like the exhausted little boy who used to fall asleep at the kitchen table, while I paid bills beside him. I'm sorry, he whispered suddenly. I frowned. For what? His eyes filled slightly. For not seeing what she was doing to you. Emotion rose instantly into my throat. Ethan. No, he shook his head. You spent your whole life protecting me. His voice cracked now. And I brought someone into our lives who made you feel small. I couldn't speak for a moment, because mothers wait years to hear certain truths from their children. Not apologies. Understanding. Real understanding. And sitting across from him now, I realized my son finally saw me clearly again for the first time in a very long while. His phone buzzed once more. Then another. Then another. This time he picked it up. Not to answer. Just to look at the screen. Over 20 missed calls. Texts flooding in from family members, groomsmen, wedding planners. Vanessa. Derek. He stared at them silently before locking the phone again. Then he looked at me. What do I do now? It was such a small question, but behind it lived an entire collapsing future. The wedding, the guests, the money spent, the embarrassment, the public disaster waiting outside this tiny diner. I took a slow breath, then answered honestly. You do the thing you'll still be able to live with 5 years from now. He stared at me quietly, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally, Ethan leaned back in the booth and closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something inside him had changed. Not healed, but decided. And deep down, I knew the wedding at that vineyard was already over. By the time Ethan and I left the diner, the wedding had already begun unraveling without us. The sky over Napa had turned gray, soft clouds drifting over the vineyards that had looked so perfect only hours earlier. Ethan drove in silence. His tuxedo jacket rested in the back seat now, his white dress shirt slightly wrinkled, sleeves rolled halfway up his arms. I had never seen him look this exhausted before. Not even after his father's funeral. One hand stayed tight around the steering wheel while the other rested near his phone in the center console. It wouldn't stop vibrating. Call after call. Text after text. At a red light, the screen lit up again. Vanessa. Then Derek. Then Vanessa's mother. Then one of the groomsmen. 37 missed calls. I looked away quietly. You don't have to ignore them forever, I said gently. Ethan gave a tired laugh under his breath. I don't even know what I'd say. The truth was, neither of us fully understood what happened next. Because calling off a wedding wasn't just emotional. It was logistical, financial, public. Especially a wedding this expensive. 200 guests had flown into Napa. Families had booked hotels. A reception staff was preparing a 5-course dinner at that exact moment. And somewhere back at the vineyard, people were probably scrambling to explain why the groom had disappeared. Ethan exhaled slowly. I should go back. I turned toward him. Are you sure? No. His answer came immediately. Honest. Raw. But I can't leave everyone there wondering. A few seconds passed before he added quietly. And I need to end this face to face. The pain in his voice made my chest tighten again. Because no matter what Vanessa had done, this was still the woman he had planned to spend his life with. Losing trust in someone didn't erase loving them. Sometimes it made the grief worse. When we returned to the vineyard, the atmosphere had completely changed. The elegant calm from earlier was gone. Clusters of guests stood whispering near the ceremony chairs. Wedding staff moved quickly between tables with nervous expressions. A violinist continued playing softly near the garden entrance, but the music now felt awkward against the tension hanging in the air. The moment Ethan stepped out of the car, heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People stared openly. Not because they wanted drama, because everyone immediately understood something was very wrong. Vanessa appeared near the reception entrance almost instantly. Her makeup was still flawless. Her wedding dress still perfect. But panic sat visibly beneath the surface now. Ethan. She hurried toward him, heels sinking slightly into the gravel path. The moment she reached him, her eyes flicked toward me, and the change in her expression was immediate. Not guilt. Anger. Like my presence itself had become the problem. "There you are," she said sharply. "What the hell is happening?" Ethan stayed calm. "Too calm. We need to talk. We've been trying to call you for over an hour." Guests nearby pretended not to watch, but they were absolutely watching. Vanessa lowered her voice slightly. "This is humiliating." That word. Humiliating. Not heartbreaking. Not painful. Not confusing. Humiliating. Ethan noticed too. I saw it in his face immediately. He looked at her quietly for a long moment before asking, "Did you ask my mother to leave?" Vanessa froze. Only briefly, but long enough. Then she crossed her arms defensively. "Ethan, this is not the time. Answer me." A small silence followed. I just thought it would avoid unnecessary tension. My stomach tightened hearing the same cold phrasing again. Ethan stared at her. "You threw my mother out of our wedding." She was upset already. She was hurt. Vanessa's expression hardened. "Oh my God, Ethan, are we seriously doing this right now?" Her voice rose slightly now, drawing even more attention. "This day is supposed to be about us. And somehow my mother being here ruined that for you? That's not what I said." "But it's what you meant." Vanessa glanced around nervously at the watching guests. "Can we please do this privately?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I tried to trust you." The shift in his voice made Vanessa pause. Something in his tone had changed. She noticed it too. "What does that mean?" Ethan looked directly at her. "I heard you and Derek." The color drained slowly from her face. For several seconds, she said absolutely nothing. And that silence told Ethan everything. A bridesmaid standing nearby quietly covered her mouth. Someone farther back whispered, "Oh my God." Vanessa stepped closer quickly. "Ethan, listen to me." "How long?" Her eyes filled instantly with tears. Real tears. But somehow they didn't change anything now. It didn't mean anything. That sentence nearly made me flinch. Because people always said that after betrayal. As though minimizing it somehow softened the damage. Ethan laughed quietly. Not with humor. With disbelief. "You slept with my best friend." "It was a mistake." "For months." Vanessa looked shattered now. Or maybe cornered. Possibly both. Guests had fully stopped pretending not to watch anymore. Even wedding staff stood frozen nearby. The entire beautiful vineyard suddenly felt painfully small. "I was going to tell you," Vanessa whispered. "When?" She didn't answer. Because there was no good answer. A long silence stretched between them. Then Ethan asked the question that seemed to hurt him most. "Did everybody know except me?" Vanessa shook her head quickly. "No." But her hesitation came too late. And Ethan saw it. The betrayal in his eyes at that moment was almost unbearable to witness. Not just because of the affair. Because humiliation layered on top of heartbreak in a way that changed everything. He looked around slowly. At the guests. At the wedding party. At Derek standing near the reception hall unable to meet his eyes. And suddenly Ethan understood something devastating. People had suspected. Maybe not everyone. But enough. Enough for whispers. Enough for looks. Enough for quiet pity behind his back while he planned a future with someone already slipping away from him. Ethan inhaled slowly. Then he turned toward Derek. "You couldn't even tell me yourself?" Derek looked sick. "I didn't know how." "You knew how to sleep with my fiancé." "Ethan. Don't." The single word stopped him cold. For a moment no one moved. The wind shifted softly through the vineyard rows. Wedding flowers trembled slightly beneath the darkening sky. And standing there among all that expensive beauty, everything finally collapsed. Vanessa stepped closer again. "Please don't do this here." Ethan looked at her carefully, then quietly asked, "Do what?" Her voice cracked. "Throw everything away." The sadness in Ethan's expression then was worse than anger, because he looked at her like a man mourning something already dead. "You already did that," he said softly. Vanessa started crying harder. Several guests looked away uncomfortably now. Others pretended to check phones. No one knew where to look anymore. Because this wasn't dramatic movie-style screaming. It was worse. Real heartbreak rarely looked explosive. Usually it looked exactly like this. Two exhausted people standing in silence while the future they built together quietly fell apart. Finally, Ethan removed the wedding ring from his jacket pocket. He stared at it for one brief second, then gently placed it into Vanessa's hand. "I can't marry you." Her entire face crumpled. "Ethan, please. I loved you." His voice shook slightly for the first time. "I really did. That nearly broke me. Because I knew my son. And I knew those words were true." Vanessa covered her mouth as tears spilled down her face. But Ethan had already stepped back. Not cruelly. Not dramatically. Just firmly. Like someone finally accepting a truth he could no longer survive denying. And then, in front of everyone, he turned and walked away. Toward me. The entire vineyard watched him cross the gravel path. Watched him stop beside the mother his fiancé had tried to erase from the wedding. For a second, Ethan simply stood there silently beside me. Then he looked down slightly and said, "You ready to go home?" My throat tightened instantly. Because despite everything happening around us, he still called it home when he was with me. I nodded softly. Yes. And together, we walked away from the vineyard while hundreds of guests watched in stunned silence behind us. The internet found out before sunset. Of course it did. Luxury weddings had photographers, influencers, guests posting videos online all weekend. By evening, clips had already spread across TikTok and Instagram. Groom walks out of $1 million Napa wedding. Bride left crying at altar. Wedding disaster in wine country. People online filled in missing details themselves. Most of them got it wrong. Some blamed Ethan. Others blamed me. A few accused him of panicking over commitment. By midnight, one video had already reached nearly 500,000 views. A guest had filmed Ethan leaving the vineyard beside me. The caption read, "Apparently the groom chose his mother over his bride." The comments were brutal. Major mommy issues. That poor bride. Mothers like this ruin marriages. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed reading them while Ethan stood near the window staring out into the dark parking lot. "You shouldn't look at that stuff," he said quietly. I know. But I couldn't stop. Because somehow strangers online had turned me into the villain within hours. The jealous mother. The controlling parent. The bitter older woman who couldn't let go of her son. None of them knew the truth. And the worst part? I still didn't want Vanessa destroyed publicly. Despite everything. Ethan finally turned away from the window. "She's doing interviews now." I looked up sharply. "What?" One of her cousins posted videos. He rubbed his forehead tiredly. "She's telling people you manipulated me into leaving." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because I cared what strangers thought. Because after everything, Vanessa still needed someone else to blame. I lowered my eyes slowly. "This is becoming ugly." Ethan looked at me for a long moment. Then quietly said, "No." His voice stayed calm. It was already ugly. A heavy silence settled over the room. Then his phone buzzed again. This time he looked at the screen for a while before speaking. "It's one of the bridesmaids." "Why?" "She says there's something I should see." His expression darkened slightly. "What is it?" Ethan swallowed once. Then turned the phone toward me. Screenshots. Hotel reservations. Messages. Dates. Proof. Not rumors anymore. Not suspicions. Evidence. The affair had been going on for almost 7 months. I covered my mouth slowly. And across from me, My son stared down at the screen with the exhausted expression of someone realizing the life he believed in had been quietly breaking long before today. Outside the hotel, rain finally began falling softly over Napa Valley. And deep inside, I realized something else too. The truth was finally starting to surface. And once it did, everything would change. 3 months after the wedding collapsed, the internet had already moved on. That was the strange thing about public humiliation. While it felt life-destroying in the moment, the world eventually got bored and searched for someone else to judge. But for Ethan, the damage didn't disappear so easily. Some mornings, I still heard him pacing around my small Sacramento house before sunrise. Some nights, he sat quietly at the kitchen table long after midnight staring into nothing while untouched coffee went cold beside him. Heartbreak changed people slowly. Not all at once. Like water wearing down stone. After leaving Napa, Ethan moved into my guest room temporarily. At first, he insisted it would only be for a week or two until he figured things out. But weeks turned into months. And honestly, I didn't mind hearing another person in the house again. The silence after my husband died had lasted too many years. At first, Ethan barely talked about Vanessa. He handled the practical things instead. Canceling contracts, meeting with attorneys, untangling shared accounts, returning wedding gifts. Every conversation sounded emotionally exhausted. Not dramatic, just tired. The kind of tired that came from discovering the future you imagined no longer existed. One evening, I found him sitting alone on the back porch watching the sunset bleed orange across the neighborhood rooftops. He looked calmer than he had in weeks, but also older somehow. I stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He accepted one quietly. Thanks. We sat in silence for a while. The neighborhood around us was ordinary. Dogs barking in the distance. Sprinklers clicking across dry lawns. Someone mowing their grass 3 houses down. No vineyards. No luxuriistats. No photographers hiding behind flower arrangements waiting to capture perfect moments. Just normal life. Finally, Ethan spoke. You know what the weirdest part is? What? I miss who I thought she was. The honesty in that sentence hurt. Because grief wasn't always about losing a person. Sometimes it was about losing the version of the future you built around them. I keep replaying everything, he admitted quietly, trying to figure out what was real. I looked down at my coffee. Did you love her? He nodded immediately. Yeah. No hesitación. No bitterness. Just sadness. That's why it hurt so much. A long silence settled between us again. Then Ethan laughed softly under his breath. You know something embarrassing? What? I spent years trying to become part of her world. I glanced toward him. The money. The image. He shook his head slowly. All of it. He stared out across the neighborhood. I thought success looked like country clubs and expensive vacations and knowing the right people. His voice softened, but none of those people actually cared about each other. The sunset light caught his face then, and suddenly I saw traces of the little boy he used to be before adulthood convinced him he had to constantly prove himself. I think somewhere along the way, he admitted, I got embarrassed by where I came from. The words landed quietly between us. Not cruel. Just painfully honest. I smiled faintly. Well, Sacramento isn't exactly glamorous. Ethan looked at me immediately. No, he shook his head. I mean us. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my chest. Mom, you worked yourself half to death raising me. His eyes glistened slightly now. And instead of appreciating that, I spent years trying to impress people who looked down on you. I looked away quickly before tears could fully form. Because mothers didn't need grand speeches from their children. Sometimes a single moment of understanding healed wounds nobody else could see. A breeze moved softly through the yard. Then Ethan said something that surprised me. I drove past Dad's old restaurant yesterday. I blinked. The building on Fulton Avenue? Yeah. I hadn't stepped inside that building in almost 8 years. After my husband died, I couldn't afford to keep the restaurant open alone. Eventually I sold most of the equipment and locked the doors for good. The memory still hurt too much to revisit. Ethan stared into his coffee thoughtfully. The lease sign is still up. I frowned slightly. That place is falling apart. Maybe. He smiled faintly. But it used to make people happy. The words settled quietly inside me. Because he was right. That tiny restaurant had once been the center of our lives. Simple food. Homemade soups. My husband greeting customers by name. Ethan doing homework in the back booth after school while I balanced receipts beside the register. We weren't rich. But we were happy there. A few days later, Ethan asked if I wanted to drive by the building with him. At first, I almost said no. Too many memories. Too much grief attached to that place. But somehow we ended up standing outside the old restaurant together on a warm Thursday afternoon. The paint had faded badly. Dust coated the windows. The old sign leaned slightly crooked above the entrance. Still, when I looked at it, something inside my chest softened instead of hurting. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets. You know, he said quietly. People are tired of fake. I smiled slightly. That sounds dramatic. I'm serious. He looked at me. Everything about that wedding was designed to impress strangers. And look how that turned out. I laughed softly for the first time in months. A real laugh. Not forced. Not polite. And Ethan smiled hearing it. I miss this version of you, he admitted. What version? The one who laughs. Emotion caught unexpectedly in my throat again. Because grief had swallowed so much of our family over the years that neither of us realized how serious we'd both become. A week later, Ethan made a decision. He left the corporate consulting firm where he had worked for nearly 6 years. Not dramatically. No angry resignación. He simply realized he no longer wanted a career built around people constantly pretending to be more important than they really were. Instead, he used part of his savings to help me reopen the restaurant. Small at first. Just breakfast and lunch. Nothing fancy. We painted the walls ourselves. Repaired old booths. Hung family photos near the counter. And slowly, people started coming back. Former customers recognized our name. Construction workers stopped in before shifts. Families came after Little League games. Retired couples lingered over coffee for hours. Nobody cared about appearances there. Nobody cared about status. They only cared whether the food felt warm and honest. And somehow, that mattered more. One rainy afternoon about 6 months after the wedding, a woman in her 20s approached our counter looking nervous. You're Ethan, right? She asked carefully. He looked up from the register. Yeah. Her eyes widened slightly. Oh my God. I knew it. I immediately recognized the expression. Internet recognition. The wedding video. Even months later, people still occasionally connected him to the viral story. The woman smiled awkwardly. I saw the Napa wedding thing online. Ethan glanced down briefly before smiling politely. Yeah, that was me. I just wanted to say, she hesitated. You did the right thing. His expression softened slightly. Thank you. After she left, I watched him quietly wiping down the counter. You okay? He nodded. Then after a moment, he said something I knew I'd remember for the rest of my life. Walking away was the first honest decision I'd made in years. The restaurant buzzed softly around us. Dishes clattered. Coffee brewed. Rain tapped gently against the front windows. And standing there watching my son smile naturally again for the first time in a very long while, I realized something important. Vanessa hadn't destroyed his life. She had exposed a life that was already built on the wrong foundation. That wedding day hadn't taken my son away from me. It brought him back. Later that night, after we closed the restaurant, I found myself looking through an old family photo album alone in my living room. There was one picture of Ethan at 10 years old standing inside the original restaurant beside his father. Flour on his cheeks. Huge grin. Completely happy. I touched the edge of the photograph gently, and for the first time since Napa Valley, I no longer felt humiliation when I remembered that wedding. Only clarity. Because sometimes the most painful endings weren't punishments. Sometimes they were rescue. And somewhere between heartbreak, public embarrassment, and losing the perfect future he thought he wanted, my son finally found his way home again.